Awesome.
So Mike, what is your background? What got you into all this defense stuff?
So I've been interested in martial arts since I was a kid. I grew up in the Chicago area, and early 1970s was kind of the beginning of the big martial arts boom, the Bruce Lee era and all that type of stuff. So it was a popular culture thing. And I also grew up in a place called Cicero, which is kind of a grungy suburb of Chicago, where self-defense skills were kind of a useful aspect of life skills. So it was something that I felt was relevant, was interesting to me, certainly because of popular culture at the time. But as I looked more and more at the martial arts, I saw just kind of the depth of knowledge. I'm always fascinated by things that people put their heart and soul into. So obviously when you're fighting for your life, the skill sets that come out of that type of commitment are things that people tend to be pretty adamant about, put a lot of work and effort into, and it creates kind of special, very strong opinions. So that fascinated me.
Excellent. So why did you start MBC?
The roots of MBC go back to kind of my original interest in knives. So when I was studying my first martial art, American self-protection was the first formal martial arts study that I did. And ASP was essentially a hybrid martial art, included elements of savate, judo, aikido, and Western boxing. And we were learning knife defenses in that art. We got to that point and I said, okay, this is great. This is stuff that I really want to have as part of my self-defense skill set. And some of my training partners and I really tried to kind of turn up the intensity as far as our training. And what we found was the knife defenses fell apart very quickly. And that was primary concern for me. That was one of the things that scared me the most. So I went to my instructor and I said, hey, our knife defenses suck. I want to learn something better. And his advice, which really was kind of the spark for everything, he said, if you want to learn how to defend against a weapon, learn how to use the weapon, because that teaches you its attributes and its capabilities, and then you can capitalize on its limitations. So I said, okay, let's learn knife. He was a former Army Ranger. He had some military knife training, so he taught us what he knew and had other like-minded people who were also interested in the stuff, and we decided to form our own little training group. We started doing our own thing. And I really couldn't find any good information that was kind of an A to Z presentation of here's how to develop knife skill. I started buying books like military training manuals, the World War II manuals, the World War I manuals, because that was some of the only written information that was available. Reading Soldier of Fortune magazine, which came out in the mid-1970s. So you had David Steele, who was writing articles on knife fighting and various elements, but it was really just scattered information. There wasn't a good curriculum. And I wanted to have that. So as I started learning more and more and I started putting pieces together on my own, that was kind of the impetus for MBC, but it all sprang from the idea of being attacked by a knife scared me the most. So I wanted to learn the other side of that equation.
So it basically came out of a necessity for your own self-preservation.
Yeah, when you look at self-defense, I mean, you try to look at all the different aspects, and there are certain things, we have certain primal fears, and the idea of somebody with an edged weapon is one of the things that was most scary to me. And what was interesting about it was as I learned more and more about it, and especially when I heard about the Filipino martial arts. Filipino martial arts were not a big thing as far as commercial martial arts, especially in the 1970s. Really didn't start coming into their own until the mid to late 1980s, where they were actually publicly available and being taught. They were kept very close hold within the Filipino community. But as I heard about them, it's like, this is kind of the curriculum that I'm looking for. This is something that's been organized and is a strong cultural presence in the Filipino martial arts. So joined the Army when I was 17, went into the military, ended up being stationed in Hawaii where there's a large Filipino population. So I think, okay, I'm good to go. I'm going to get the training that I wanted all along. So I went to the Filipino Chamber of Commerce and I said, look, I'm a military service member stationed here in Hawaii, and I'm looking for Filipino martial arts instructors. They gave me a list of names and phone numbers, started calling people, told them what I wanted, and they said, what's your name? Mike Janich. You're not Filipino. Click. And they hung up the phone because they weren't teaching outside of their own culture, outside of their own community. And I finally had one teacher, Raymond Tobosa, who was willing to take me in. And I said, Mr. Tobosa, I really want to learn Filipino knife. And he's like, I'll teach you stick. It's like, no, I want to learn knife. And he's like, no, you learn stick. And so I understood the limitations of what he was willing to share. And that's fine. But the cool thing about the Filipino martial arts, and when Dan Inosanto's book on the Filipino martial arts came out, for me, that was a game changer, because that book explained that essentially the best skill sets are designed to be a universal skill set that then adapts to the attributes of the different weapons you use. So if you have an impact weapon, you break bones. If you have an edge weapon, then you cut tissue. So what I did was I took that theme, took what I was starting to learn from the Filipino martial arts, and I was in military intelligence, I was a trained intelligence analyst, took the analytical process and started applying that and said, okay, what can I do with my stick technique to make it knife technique? And that really was kind of the impetus for developing a curriculum around MBC.
So effectively, where the concepts came.
The concepts part, what's interesting is the MBC acronym. So again, historically, as far as the development of everything, I started putting together pieces as we started to get a little bit of insight into actual Filipino knife training. I was cherry picking little bits and pieces and taking the stuff that I felt was most useful to me and kind of from a logical self-defense standpoint made sense. And as I was doing that, when I finally got it into a curriculum form, it was actually in 1998, Gunsight Training Center, Gunsight Academy, had an edge weapon symposium. They invited me as one of the instructors, and they said, we need a written curriculum. It was the first time I committed the curriculum. Shortly after that, Spyderco asked me to teach for them, and Spyderco coined the term martial blade craft. So Sal Glesser, founder of Spyderco, he didn't want to say knife fighting. He wanted something that was a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more politically correct. So martial, blade, and then craft, just in the sense of not arts and crafts, but more of the idea of a skill set, but still walking that PC line. So when I started teaching for Spyderco in 1999, I was teaching under the MBC banner, Martial Bladecraft. In 2004, I got a job opportunity to work for Blackhawk Products Group, and I was going to be essentially a competitor to Spyderco. Although I wasn't working for Spyderco full time, we had a really strong relationship, good friendship, and when I went to work for another company, I felt it would be disingenuous for me to teach for Spyderco and then work for another company, and it would just be kind of a conflict of interest. So we parted friends, and what I did was I took Martial Blade Craft and I said, okay, you keep your original term. The MBC acronym had already stuck and people were familiar with it. So I changed the concepts, changed craft to concepts. And it also, I think, was also reflective of my mindset at the time, the conceptual approach to self-defense, having a small skill set that's versatile enough to be able to apply to a lot of different circumstances.
Excellent. That makes perfect sense. So what would you say are the advantages MBC has over other systems?
When you look at knife fighting systems, you look at knife technique in general, what you find in many cases, especially in the Filipino martial arts, which is kind of where a lot of it is drawn from, much of it was designed for battlefield application. So when you look at Filipino warriors who would use it when the Spaniards were essentially a conquering force in the Philippines, when they used it against the Japanese. Where the Filipino martial arts were strongest was typically when they had some type of invading force, and in that context, it was warfare. When you try to take that same thing and then apply it in self-defense, it tends to be overkill. It tends to be really inappropriate for responsible, ethical self-defense, and also self-defense that's going to keep you out of prison. So what I tried to do in the process was, first of all, how do I take this stuff that has been proven as a battlefield system and be able to temper that so it becomes responsible self-defense, and also make sure that it's applied with the knives we really carry. It's one thing to have skill with a sword or with a big bladed knife or something like that, but when you carry a knife that has a 3-inch blade, your tactics have to be appropriate for that as well. So really the logic of MBC, I think, is the thing that is most distinctive about us and what separates us from the traditional Filipino martial arts. You're going to fight with the knife you actually carry. You want to make sure you quantify the destructive power of that knife. You want to make sure that you focus on stopping power, which is the real goal in self-defense, is stopping the attacker. And in putting those things together, what you also have to do is make sure that you have a good knowledge of human anatomy so that the anatomy, your anatomical knowledge allows you to take the knife you carry and the destructive capacity and achieve stopping power in an efficient, effective way. So there's a lot of misconceptions about how that happens and how that occurs. One of the other distinctive things about MBC is over the years I have been able to partner with people in the medical profession where instead of taking kind of what people believe to be common knowledge, oh, if you do this with a knife, then you get this result. Validating that by talking with trauma surgeons, by talking with physical therapists who work with people who've had various types of industrial injuries and things like that, really digging deep into the medical side of it and making sure that what we do from a tactical standpoint has a desired physiological effect.
So what is the value of this training in our current societal climate, if you will? Things seem to be getting very interesting as of late.
Things are getting very interesting, and it's to backtrack a little bit as far as my kind of the historical development of MBC. A lot of people say, well, you know, why would you prefer to carry a knife? Why would you do that in the first place? If you can carry a gun, that would be better. So when I was in the military, when I was working for the government, I lived overseas, lived in places where I couldn't own a gun. I certainly couldn't carry a gun, but I was also traveling to places where there was high levels of violence. I was working in detention centers in Hong Kong, working in detention centers and in refugee camps in the Philippines, all throughout Southeast Asia. So even though I had a diplomatic passport, still couldn't own a gun, carry a gun. So the knife also became a thing where it's like, hey, I can carry this, I have a lethal weapon. If I have skills in its use, this is something that can go with me everywhere. So when we fast forward now to modern climate, what we have is more and more situations where the way that the powers that be want to keep us safe is by denying us access to weapons. So when we look at the gun control aspects of things, non-permissive environments, just all the limitations that are associated with that, the knife is still something that we can carry just about everywhere in the U.S. It's something that's convenient, and it really is something that's easy to make part of your everyday lifestyle. So when you look at the knife as a weapon of choice, it makes sense because of its versatility and its ability to use it anywhere. And then what we look at with the training is how can we take the same basic tactics and be able to apply them to a broad set of circumstances. Many people, when they look at knife fighting, they say, okay, it's dueling, two guys with knives. We always dispel that right off the bat. We say what we're trying to do is use the knife in justifiable circumstances where we're in fear of our life or in fear of grievous bodily injury, but a broad set of circumstances. So now if you've got somebody, let's say, picking up a skateboard and wants to bash your head in with it, can you use your knife to defend against that? Absolutely. So what we do is we take the same skills that we would develop in standard MBC, and what we start doing is looking at world events, looking at societal events, looking at what potential threats we might face, and say, okay, how do we take our skills and adapt it to that, and adapt it to that? And that's one of the other unique things about MBC is we're constantly relating back to the problem. So the problem is the actual potential for violent threats that we face, and making sure that our techniques always can be applied to those situations.
Part of what I love about MBC is it's constantly evolving. So it's not hamstrung by tradition, if you will.
Well, one of the things that, again, going back to uniqueness of MBC, in a lot of martial arts, the goal is to make everyone look exactly the same. We all wear the same uniform, we do the same form, we do the same things, and essentially what you're doing is you're putting the execution of the art above the self-defense needs of the people doing it. Well, if you're studying martial arts because you want a cross-cultural experience, if you want fitness, if you want something that is more of a physical discipline, that's great. If you want self-defense, then what you need is self-defense skill. And the shortest route to that is not through a martial art that stopped evolving 200 years ago.
Absolutely. So, many people, I feel, want to know how to defend themselves, but they're apprehensive in getting started, whether that means they're just kind of intimidated to be a beginner at something again, or maybe they're afraid that they won't be automatically good when they start. What would you say to those people who have a sort of inherent interest in this and want to learn how to defend themselves or their family members, but just have that apprehension?
Well, one of the things we try to do in MBC, one of the things that I've developed as far as my teaching methodology, is to front load a lot of the intellectual side of what we do. And what I mean by that is, how does our stuff work? What is the logic behind what we do? And what that also allows people to do, if they want to research MBC, if they want to get familiar with it, they can kind of do a lot of homework before they ever step out on the mat. So what it allows them to do is to prepare mentally to look at stuff and say, okay, I understand what he's trying to achieve. I know that I don't have that skill yet, but I can wrap my head around the concept of what we're trying to achieve. So when I do get out there and do the physical part, I'm only focusing on the physical skill. I don't have to take in everything. And what it does is it empowers people because they have a clearer understanding of what they're trying to achieve. The learning process becomes easier, and it kind of takes away that intimidation. I think it's also helpful to look at, especially if you have a chance to observe an MBC event or just become familiar with who we are as a community, what you're going to see is we have people who are training well into their 60s and early 70s. We have people who have all types of physical ailments and stuff like that, whether it's an illness, a pre-existing condition, some type of bad shoulder, bad knee, whatever it is. One of the big things we do is we try to make sure that whatever we do, we're empowering you to work with the physical attributes you've got now and make the best of them and be efficient. So simply understanding that we're not going to try to make you into an Olympic athlete who has to jump and do flying kicks and all this other kind of stuff. We're going to look at you and say, okay, cool. Based on who you are as a person, we'll adapt our skills and give you something that you can use. And I think that mindset is a great way of taking away that intimidation because it's much more welcoming than what you'll get from a lot of martial arts.
I would have to say that you did very well at that. Also, it's a very welcoming community. So.
It's a great community. I'm reminded every year at Martial Blade Camp, I have a bunch of people come together. It's tons of work for me to organize the event and everything else. But once everyone comes together, the generosity of the sponsors, the generosity of the instructors as far as helping people out, everyone goes out of their way to care for everybody else. And you really see that focused in this event, but then you see it all year long. We've had people this year, 2020 has been just a crazy year for everybody, and there's been a lot of people who, in addition to the broad scope of things, have had individual setbacks and challenges. And every time you see the MBC community rally around them, just words of encouragement, help, financial support, whatever it is. Once people get into the MBC family and they realize how special it is, it's great because it's very self-selecting. We get the right people for the right reasons, and people who are looking to feed their ego, people who are looking for rank and black belts and all that other kind of stuff, who are training for very different reasons. They realize they don't fit here, and the crowd of good people continues to grow because good people attract other good people.
Absolutely. So, what advice resonated with you the most when you were learning how to defend yourself? What really stood out to you? Maybe one or two sentences, maybe a mentor told you, or something you picked up along the way.
Again, I think probably the most profound thing, and the one that I constantly will cite, is going back to that, if you want to learn how to defend against a weapon, learn how to use the weapon. And this is important too for anyone who practices a self-defense system. If somebody tries to tell you, hey, we do Shaolin Kung Fu and we're going to do Shaolin Kung Fu pistol disarms, it's like, did the Shaolin thing, did they have guns back then? Was that like a core skill set for them? It doesn't fit. You can take those concepts and apply them to something, but when you look at truly understanding how a weapon works, a lot of martial artists are intimidated by firearms. It's like, ooh, I don't want anything to do with that. Well, in today's day and age, again, we have to look at active shooters. We have to look at the rise in violent crime with COVID-19 and all that kind of stuff. You have to look at the reality of the threat. Is there a possibility that you could be attacked by somebody or threatened by somebody at close range with a firearm? Absolutely. So it makes sense to learn how to defend against it. In order to do that, you have to understand how a firearm works. So again, if you want to learn how to defend against a weapon, learn how to use the weapon, and it just gives you that depth of understanding and understanding what the problem is.
That's great. So you're famous for saying, have a plan, work the plan. So what's your plan now?
The global plan, the plan for domination of the Western Hemisphere. Which one?
I mean, I guess it can be in any way. Like, what do you want to see happen? It could be with your life, with MBC. I mean, I feel like those two things are kind of hard to separate
Yep.
at times. So what is just moving forward? What do you see? Do you see new challenges for yourself on the horizon, or is it doubling down on what you're doing now, further investing, getting down more to the root of these things and refining them?
Well, this is Martial Blade Camp number 18. Been at this a while, and again, we got a great community that we're building. What I really want to do, I know that I can only do this for so long, and I think the current world situation has taught us that we can't take things for granted. There's a lot of uncertainties in life, so what we have to do is focus on the idea of empowering those around us to continue what we do. So what I'm looking at is really working on instructor development with my instructors. And it's one thing to be able to, it's like the old saying, you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Well, what I want to do is teach them to think. I want them to learn the analytical process that I use to create MBC and its other systems, so that the evolution that we have doesn't stop with me. If I'm hit by a bus tomorrow, I want all my instructors to be able to get together and first of all not fight with each other, and to basically take into consideration what I've taught them as far as history of martial arts, the thought process behind things, and essentially collectively continue that thought process to allow the evolution to continue and allow MBC hopefully to continue to be taught well beyond my lifetime.
It's a good plan.
Best I can do for now.
So I guess the last thing is, being part of the MBC community. I would say, it's kind of a little bit before 2018 camp, started to get into it.
Yep.
And you kind of touched on this. There's just so many great people. Do you ever just take a step back and look at the community you've built, look at basically the fruits of your labor, and just say, wow, this is something incredible?
Every day. And what's interesting, my wife, when she was an IBMer when she retired and started to help me out a little bit with MBC, and started getting involved and helping me with camp and all that kind of stuff, she would just be like, wait a minute, this guy here hasn't been to camp in several years, but he just sent you a check as a scholarship for somebody who's a first-time camper. I'm like, yeah, the guy's awesome. His health doesn't allow him to train currently, but he's still supportive of MBC and he's still a family member. We had other people who, because of COVID-19, because of other personal issues and everything, had registered for camp and then had to withdraw. They're like, you know what? Make sure that my tuition goes to benefit somebody else. I see just the kindness and the generosity of everybody in the MBC family, and we're reminded of that every day. You see it in social media, you see it just, the more I look at the community and the more that I see the interaction between people and how they help each other out and everything, that's the real legacy. It's one thing to say, hey, this is a cool martial art, this is a cool self-defense system, and it's got all this great information, and yeah, it works. But the reason it works is because of the people behind it. And that's the real legacy. So again, we go back to that plan. What do we want to continue that evolution? And that really is the spirit that drives it all.
It's an amazing spirit. So I guess all I have left to say is thank you for creating something so amazing. And I've trained with a lot of people from all walks of life, and I would have to say it's you guys are pretty close, 1 and 2, or maybe close to tied. You and Tom Gibbons are two of the most genuine, down to earth, no BS people that are sort of part of this walk of life. And I really appreciate the authenticity and just the friendship and the brotherhood and with everything that you've created. So,
Well, thank you for the compliment. I've had the honor of meeting Tom a few times, and I hold him in very high regard as far as his training. So that's definitely a huge compliment, and thank you for being part of the family.
excellent. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Cool, cool. That work?